where we're going to be talking about measurement in a post-truth world. We're joined by a very distinguished panel today. To my right, you have Ben Levine from Ketchum Global Research, Ngaire Crawford from Isentia in New Zealand, and MichaelO'Connell from AAP in Australia. The panel today will be talking about how we're going to be conducting measurement and evaluation in a world where content is being driven from actors who aren't so good, where information is frequently fake, and where there's a integrity challenge to communications around the world, both from a public affairs point of view and from a point of view of commercial entities. We did conduct a survey. Ben put together a survey which was completed by well over 100 AMEC members, in which we asked a number of questions about fake news and how it was impacting them and their organizations, and what plans they had for the future and how they were going to cope with such a new reality. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Ben to come down and present his slides and talk a bit more about the research. After that, each of the panel speakers will have a few words, and we'll have a dialogue with all of you in the room. Ben.
Thank you, Mazen. Good afternoon, everyone. Glad you could all make it. I know we're competing with Professor Jim, so that's always a tough task. So first thing, I want to give a shout out and thank, Ngaire, who's on the panel with me. We're members of the Young Leaders Group at at AMEC. In that group, we bring together young leaders within the measurement and evaluation profession from around the world to share ideas and to really learn from one another and advance the profession. And when we were talking about things that we wanted to do this year, one of the topics that came up that was actually raised by our colleague Orla Burke from Cision, she had the great idea to why don't we do something around fake news? Alternative facts and misinformation is something that's been in the media quite a bit and has ramifications and implications not just in the US and UK, but around the world. And I think it's something that we've kind of touched on some of the themes and how that's already shaped the world, be it the Trump election, Brexit, et cetera. And I think that may be some of the themes you see today. So I just want to thank my colleagues for helping with that. We did put out a survey to the membership to get their points of view. And before we get to that, I just want to kind of give a bit of a perspective on fake news and how from our point of view, how we got here. So what you see up on the big screen is a shot, a still from President Trump's 2020 campaign ad. You heard me correctly. He is campaigning for re-election in 2020 already. And his message and his ad is all about fake news. And when he refers to fake news, he's kind of used it as a proxy term to cast any media organization, any opinion leader, or anyone who disagrees with the administration's policies, point of views, and information and story that they're trying to tell the public. Now, administrations in the US in the past have certainly disagreed with the media before, but they've never weaponized communications, I think, in the way that President Trump and his administration has. And I think that if successful, this has implications for how other institutions and organizations will communicate in the future. So just a kind of quick snapshot of how did we get there? What kind of drove, how did this environment come about, particularly in the US and even in the UK with Brexit? Well, I think we could all agree, particularly in traditionally Western markets in Europe and the US, conversation around politics, issues, the things that people tend to get very passionate about has become, you could argue, more polarized than ever. And this polarization has caused some people, a lot of people, to kind of jump into their bubble, be that within their communities, certainly within their social media communities, where they want to go and confirm their points of view, to talk with others who think and espouse the same beliefs that they have. And we know that you couple that with people's consumption habits. People use social media as an access point, and we've talked about the rise of news aggregators and social media, and Facebook in particular being one of those aggregation points. And I think it's something like 60%, more than 60% of Americans get their news through social media. And in addition, we've seen statistics, and this was, I believe, in the Washington Post last year, 59% of people will share stories without even reading them, just based on the headline. And this is the theme that came up yesterday. Now you couple that with automation, and you call, algorithms, you can think of bots, you can think of trolls, you can think of this environment that has kind of fed off people's propensity to share things without knowing what it is, to be drawn towards individual content, has really kind of driven the sharing of fake news, alternative facts, and misinformation. And running underneath all of this is the erosion of trust. So I think the trust barometer has been referenced a few times over the last few days. About 43% in that latest survey of people globally mistrust the media, and trust among all institutions is at an all-time low. So how are some slides went out of order. That's all right. It's skipping a slide. Okay, well, there was a whole slide there about how some institutions are fighting back, and I'll just explain that to you. So, Facebook, for one, I think we've all seen that Facebook recently put out kind of guidelines and policies about how to identify fake news on its site and encouraging people to read headlines, check the URLs of the sites. They actually put out some advertising in media across the UK to kind of highlight the fact that they've done this. They've also launched the Facebook Journalism Project, which are now trying to work with professional journalists to help identify fake news on its site and take it off the site. Wikipedia has recently launched WikiTribune, which has a similar mission. They're working with journalists and other research professionals to ensure that news content on Wikipedia is accurate and telling the truth, in particular when it comes to news. And this is something that's really important, as Wikipedia is one of the more referenced and trusted sources, I would argue, online. And even Google has taken a lot of steps to remove some of those clickbait factories and other fake enterprises. And I think last year they took down 1,300 what you call tabloid sites, which in other words, fake news websites. So when I've looked at all this and what I think that it means for the world we're living in, is that trust today is more important than truth. And so I come from a communications company, Ketchum. So if you think about what that means from a communication standpoint, how we need to think about how we do business, how we need to be engaging with different publics and stakeholders, this idea that it's not the accuracy of what one says, it's the trust that the person receiving that information puts in the purveyor of that information, has huge ramifications across the board. So I did say we did a survey, so we just wanted to look in quickly to what some of the feedback that we got from the membership. So we did the survey about attitudes towards fake news, how they're talking to clients about it, and what do they think the impacts of the future will be. And I'm going to highlight just some stats. There'll be more to come from the Young Leaders Group throughout the year. So more than half of all the members in our survey reported that clients consider fake news to be a serious threat to their reputation going forward. That 59% have started to discuss what to do about fake news with their clients and the steps that they can and should be taken. That they believe that it's going to only continue to be an issue on the rise over the next year. If we think about, where are we most vulnerable when it comes to fake news? Unsurprisingly, nearly everyone in the survey said social media. But what I think we need to consider, and particularly from an evaluation standpoint, and then how do we address that and counsel our clients appropriately, is it's not necessarily the channel that's most vulnerable, but the interplay between these different channels and how one drives content to another. And that even though if misinformation is broadcast on social, but the source is a source that some people trust or is from a source that people need to listen to, such as the President of the United States, that's still going to perpetuate itself and be broadcast and filtered through all these different channels. So I think that makes spotting it, evaluating it, and reporting back very difficult in a client situation, potentially. And then lastly, how it's working with how the relationship with their clients currently has been impacted. And what we found is that it hasn't had a major impact as of yet, where 40% say that with the rise of fake news, that their clients are becoming more reliant on media intelligence companies such as themselves, that about half have alerted their clients to fake news when they've spotted it. Now, this doesn't suggest that they wouldn't do so, but it could be that perhaps they haven't been affected by fake news as of yet. And a very small percentage believe that trust has been eroded with media intelligence providers. So I think it all just, kind of looking at the results and some of what we highlighted here, is that clearly fake news is something that's on the minds of our clients, it's on the minds for people within our organizations. We know it's something we need to be aware of. We haven't quite yet gotten to the point of action, but I think that it's something that's going to be top of mind in the news, certainly, for the next several months, and something we will need to be thinking about. How do we address this? How do we counsel our clients about it? And then how do we develop methods and approaches to identify it, flag it up to our client, and craft the appropriate response? So that's everything I had from my perspective. I'm now going to hand it over to Ngaire.
Thank you.
I'm just going to lurk behind a lectern. It's my preference. Kia ora, everyone. I'm Ngaire. I head up the Insights Division for Isentia in New Zealand. Ideally, I'm here to give a perspective on fake news from the side of a measurement professional. There are really clear challenges that are around how we gather and differentiate information. But I think the nature of being a good analyst is that you have a little bit of a mix of nihilism as well as a little bit of a mix of Pollyanna. So from an academic perspective, news is and always has been a construct. Propaganda has always had really different political and corporate faces. But the concept of fake news being in the cultural consciousness is an amazing mandate for good research. Ultimately, anything that reinforces that media and audiences are complicated and fluid has a huge value in how we position the work that we do. I'm going to try and be as tactical as I can in this point of view. For some of you, the suggestions might be really obvious. It certainly echoes a lot of what we've heard in the last couple of days. But I do want to give a bit more of a, I guess, in the trenches point of view. What I really think fake news means is that we have to ask bigger questions and we have to use a bigger lens. Echoing what Ben said about trust and truth, I've kind of broken this down a little bit more about accuracy and audiences. We spend a lot of time looking at the intricacies of how something has been communicated, if that communication has been successful. I think fake news helps reaffirm that this is almost a secondary frame. So understanding communication in the wider scheme of information that's available and the habits of an audience are the more desirable primary data set. And while the concept of constructed news and propaganda isn't new, the audience behaviour associated with it is. We have the ability now to map out audiences and the kind of choices they make online more than we ever have before. So the challenge is now that we need to be able to determine what data is the most valuable to answer different questions and how we create a seamless, actionable answer from that. Tactically, it makes me ask a few questions. As an analyst quirk, I tend to think more in questions than I think in answers. I don't necessarily have the exact answers here because every client and every market is different, but I think these kind of help you see where I think the challenges and opportunities are. The main question I'm asking myself is whether or not is accuracy the most important frame. I live in an insights world where the guiding light is still very much sentiment and tone and how a point of view is communicated. While I feel that we've been moving away from traditional brand analysis for quite some time, it does reaffirm that value of a wider look, looking at an issue in more detail rather than specifically looking at a brand. Instead of looking at one company or a series of companies, look at a bigger issue. Instead of looking at one bank or 5 banks or all the banks in your market, how do people understand and discuss wealth and investment or retirement? What does it mean to them? And more importantly, where do they get their information? And is this information accurate? Where does traditional media fit? Where does social fit? What's the relationship between the two? And I think context becomes the unique value proposition in this kind of post-truth, fake news, alternative facts era. It becomes our role to offer clients an evidence-based point of view on how a market or an audience is behaving about key issues, whether it's a political issue, if it's something more specific. I was trying to think of a way to relate this to work that we're doing at the moment. And while I haven't necessarily dealt directly in the idea of fake news, we deal with the idea of misinformation all the time. So one of the main parallels I can draw at the moment is that my team are currently working on a big project with a pharmaceutical company, which is mostly to help them while they are undergoing a campaign about one specific vaccine as it moves on to a funded schedule in New Zealand. But I don't think that's the interesting and relevant question to answer for them. It's how do people currently discuss vaccinations? What information do they interact with? What's all the information that their key audience has access to? How do they play with it? How does it work? What resonates? How can they actually use this information better? So yeah, in a very quick nutshell, because I think I have about 10 seconds left, while fake news as an idea is something that, from an academic perspective, concerns me as a kind of person in the world, I'm really excited about what this means professionally. I think that for us, it's going to force us to think and react differently and completely speed up our continued evolution into providers of insights rather than people that necessarily only analyse media. Thanks. Pass on to Michael.
Thank you very much.
I'm a little bit of a ring-in to this group, to the young leaders group, because I think, as you can see, I'm neither young and, according to my staff, it's questionable if I'm a leader as well, but they've brought me in to talk about from a publishing point of view. And as you can see, I'm from Australian Associated Press, so we are Australia's national news agency, and therefore really at the forefront, some would say, of fake news. We employ more than 330 working journalists. We have about 270 sub-editors. And when I say sub-editors, we are the people who are putting out the newspapers, so we're doing the layout, doing the headlines, doing the fact-checking. And we have about 100 photographers as well, 70 photographers as well that are taking the pictures for our shareholders, which is News Limited and Fairfax. So we are constantly, as I said, at the forefront of fake news and trying to work our way through it. I think one of the key things that we have to be mindful of is that the term of fake news. Within a news agency, within a newspaper, it's either news, or it's lies, or it's somewhere in between. We've come up with this terminology, or the terminology has come up for us, that Trump obviously has come out with fake news, but we are trying to wage, I guess, a constant vigilance against the use of the word fake news, because there is no such thing as fake news. It falls between two things. And as journalists, we have to be conscious of how we approach all of these things regarding the fake news. So we ignore all surveys which can be biased or tweaked towards certain results. And that doesn't help a lot of us who are working in the public relations industry, because we're trying to get our media releases out with certain results and insights within those. Similarly, we always try to retain balance in the story, and that to you may sound like, well, that's what journalists should be doing, but increasingly it's very difficult to retain some semblance of balance. You have a number of competing interests, and as we have competing interests within our own insights business, we have competing interests as journalists. We're always under pressure, either from politicians, press sector, or from other sources, to present different sides of the debate. We saw in one of Ben's slides that much of fake news relates to social media. I saw within that, Ben, it was only 4 or 5% that actually talked about or was attributed to mainstream media. And I think when we do talk about fake news, it is social media that we're talking about. As working journalists, and we are always vigilant about trying to weed out the press releases or the stories that are coming to us from various sources. It is a lot harder trying to do that with social media. The news cycle is always turning. And for example, for us at AAP, we have a mantra now: we don't do long-form journalism. We are a news agency, and we have to get our stories out within 3 minutes. All of our journalists are now going to stories equipped with video cameras. So no longer can they sit there and hide behind a television reporter's screen and ask the questions. They'll ask the questions, they'll shoot the video, they'll move to the side and upload that video back to headquarters to be uploaded to the publishers' websites within 3 minutes. We have a 3x3x3. Get the story out, ask the questions, upload it within 3 minutes. So the whole newsroom has changed and the whole life of working journalists have changed. So much so to the fact that how we attribute. So we've been burnt a couple of times at Australian Associated Press. We've been sucked in. We've published things that we shouldn't have published because we didn't do the job that we were supposed to do. The way we can get around that with the fake news is to attribute where it comes from. So what we do now is attribute according to a Twitter account linked with a certain person rather than say according to the person. And that, as I said, has caught us out, unfortunately, a number of times. I'm not going to go past this slide because we're running out of time. It's from an organisation called First Draft on 7 types of disinformation. But I want to just sort of give you a little bit of the concept of how this whole fake news works. And unfortunately, a lot of you may not know our esteemed Prime Minister of Australia, Malcolm Turnbull, but to us it's big news when he meets the Prime Minister, or when the Prime Minister meets the President of the United States. And this is how fake news starts and how it finishes. That there was a phone call that happened between our Prime Minister and the President of the United States, and it was an angry phone call. And it was reported that the President slammed the phone down on our Prime Minister and used coarse language and did everything else. The way it was reported was that the phone call wasn't as abrupt as what was made out. And this then went into the lexicon of what the conversation was between our 2 respective leaders. So apparently Trump didn't hang up. Apparently Trump didn't use bad language. Apparently Trump wasn't dismissive in the way that he spoke to the Prime Minister. This cycle has gone the full story, or the full cycle. So it's now come back where Trump admits, after having labelled the whole incident as fake news, 2 months or 3 months later when he meets the Prime Minister in person, agrees that the phone call was testy, says the relationship was a little abrupt, says he says things that he didn't mean to say, but it went into the lexicon of what was fake news. And I think from our point of view as journalists, and it makes it very hard from our point of view as communicators and as media analysts, how we have to weed our way through all of this information, because it is prevalent. Thankfully, not as prevalent in our print media as it is on social news, in social media. But I do think that we all need to be on our game as communicators, certainly us as publishers, and certainly us as journalists, to be aware that there is a lot of fake news or people trying to hoodwink us out there, and for us to be forever vigilant in what we're seeing and what we're doing, what we're reporting and what we're writing. So, thank you.
Thank you. Well, that's a good picture to keep up there.
Leave it up there.
Well, thank you all for your presentations. Ben, let me begin by asking about the survey. I think one thing that really struck me in the results was not how everyone said this is a problem or that they were worried. I think the percentage was 68% of all respondents felt there was an issue to be addressed. But then when we asked the question, how many of your clients have actually been impacted by fake news, 88% said under 10% of their clients had been impacted. So there is a fear out there, but the actual real-world reality impact on clients appears to be fairly minimal based on that survey. What's the issue over there? Why do you see that divergence?
I would suspect that at the moment right now, from where I see fake news and certainly what's been promoted, is it tends to be impacting more in a, I guess, public or government, public policy point of view. It tends to be where the attention is now, and it's used as a way to people perhaps to push political agendas. Certainly in the US and the UK, we've talked at length about how that was used, and misinformation helped impact both of those, both the Brexit vote, the election. So while perhaps it hasn't made its way into the private sector as prevalently, I think we see that divergence. For one, it's an issue because everyone's talking about it because, well, you saw on screen why they're talking about it. And they need to be aware of it because I think there's a recognition on the client side that it could be them. It could be someone out there talking about their organization in a way that is not right. I think yesterday I forget her name, but the woman from Citi talked about even the headline, getting the headline wrong about refunds for cards, and they were fine when in fact it was refunds. Is that fake news, that misinformation? I'm not sure, but certainly if someone wanted to try to take down a company, you could use what's being used in a political sense in the same way.
Sure. So it seems to be a growing problem. It hasn't had a full impact yet. It appears to have had its greatest impact in the public affairs and political area. Ngaire, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I've certainly had a lot of casual conversations with clients about fake news. Nothing specific to clients or their business. But again, it is that fake news is a particular label in a particular sphere. All clients have been stuck with misinformation, which is the same thing, it's just a different delivery
kind
system,
of
yeah.
misinformation.
Yeah.
But at AAP, is there an idea or a client, an issue, a circumstance which strikes you as being an example of a client being impacted very negatively by fake news?
Well, indeed, and the extent that people will go to try and hoodwink you is extraordinary. We had a situation where a resources activist mocked up a press release, went to the extent of photoshopping the logo onto the media release, the extent of getting the PR person's contact details and mobile details on the press release, and then typed up a fake press release and sent it to us. We're handling thousands of words a day, and we don't have the time to always verify. If we see it's from a certain person at a certain large organisation, we tend to think, well, that's probably news.
Right.
And we got caught out severely by running a media release on our wire that was totally erroneous and totally false.
So from a real-world impact point of view, what I'm hearing from the three of you would be, it is a problem, but it seems to be at a very early stage, and it's quite different substantively from misinformation, which has always been around, but it's a different, more extreme version of misinformation. Whether fake news is the right term or not is to be debated, but it seems like we're in a new era where this is going to be escalating over time, and it may go beyond the governmental, political, and public affairs space. But you bring up an important point, Michael, and that's preparation and being able to defend against that and to identify it and be able to push back. So you've talked about attribution. I went to journalism school, and that was one of the, the holy metrics and grails which we used to study all the time. In addition to the journalistic environment, how do you look at things from a research perspective? How do you differentiate between truth and trust, fake and real? And what kind of infrastructure are you building your teams for the future? That's a big question.
That's a heavy philosophical question. I mean,
it's a jet lag question.
Well, I think I'll speak from a research perspective. I mean, certainly, it's been a theme, I think, throughout the conference, is that we can't rely on one data source or one source of information to build, to understand a problem, to form hypotheses and questions, and to do proper research. So I think the work that we do and the way we're trying to operate at Ketchum is to use multiple sources of information, and sources of information that we trust and can be verifiable. So that's how we would approach it. So multiple data sources at Ketchum. What would you do at Isentia, Ngaire?
I agree about the multiple data sources. I think one of the things, truth is relative in some respects. So truth to one client is not truth to another client. So it's still in that same kind of realm of if you're measuring a point of view, you just have to look around it a little bit more. Like you have to use more information. You have to be a bit more creative about how you understand the audience and what they're reacting to and how they want to process information and what's actually resonating and what other information is out there so that you can start to weigh out a bigger picture.
It's a good point you bring. You need to be more creative about finding out the truth, if you will. What kind of person would you want in your team? What kind of person would you hire in this new fake news world, and you're running a measurement company?
I love that question. Mostly because I was talking about it a little bit earlier. I think one of the things that is really interesting and amazing about all of the discussions that everyone's having about data, there's a lot of talent in that area, but for me, I love someone who cares about how this information moves and cares about what this means and cares about truth and media as a construct. Because some of that other stuff are skills that you can learn. but being wired to want to deconstruct it, and the joy of deconstruction, and then the kind of equal joy in being able to rebuild something is a thing you have to really find in someone to hire.
If you put that in a job description, do you actually think you'd hire anybody?
I would be entertained by the results on that one, I think.
Well, I'm with you on that. Why don't we go to the floor for questions? Lots of great content here on a hot topic. Richard. If we can have the microphone in the front and another one prepared for Kali in the back.
Hi guys, so Richard speaking. Thank you for a great panel session and your presentations. I want to start by thanking Ben and all of the young leaders of the group for the fantastic work that you've done this year. It's been really inspirational and motivational for me to see what you've done. And you've got a really vibrant and engaged team who's worked on this. I know how much hard work has gone into it. So I want to start with a thank you. And I want to take this opportunity to reach out to everyone in this room and encourage you, if you've got people at manager level, late 20s perhaps, early 30s, something like that, who wants to know more and wants to get more involved with AMEC, then this is a great way of them doing it. So please reach out to Ben, I think, to get membership of the group. It has an active LinkedIn mini group as well going, I know. So that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I wanted to ask the panel was, I can't quite get past, I don't like the word fake news. I'm not saying that to undermine, but to my mind, it's just a lie. So fake news, lie, what's the difference? That's my question.
Okay. Michael?
Richard, no argument for me, and I think I mentioned the same in my presentation. That it's either a lie, it's truth, or it sits somewhere in between. And we have come up with this idea of fake news, and as I said, largely from Trump. It's entered the lexicon coming from Trump. But to me, you're right. It's not fake news. It's either truth, it's a lie, or somewhere in between.
But are we perhaps thinking too much about the terminology here? I agree with both of you. A lie is a lie. But like you very wisely pointed out a moment ago, this stuff has been going around for thousands of years. It's not particularly new. But when we refer to fake news, it would seem to me that we're really referring not to the substance of the content, but to the nature of a new mass-scaled distribution mechanism, which is allowing unverified, unattributable information to compete with traditionally verified data. So fake news might not be about the fakeness or the news, but more about how there's this new parallel flow of data competing with what we used to have.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think that's what it was leading up till about last summer. And then what President-elect Trump, or President Trump, candidate Trump at the time, just started using it as a term to describe those who disagreed with him. And he used it as a way to cast doubt and mistrust on the mainstream media, as the established media, or rather. And what that did is galvanized a lot of people who shared his point of view, be them supporters or even fringe websites and news outlets, who then started to gain prominence, and some of whom found themselves in the White House. So I would agree that it was describing this mechanism, but I think the way it's been recast, unfortunately, by President Trump, it's given it a whole new meaning.
It gives you a whole new meaning to spokesperson analysis as well. Kali, you had a question.
I did, but Richard covered it. I was going to ask, how do you get involved if you've got a young team of analysts who would be very excited about the prospect of working on such an exciting project under the AMEC banner? Is the correct procedure for them to approach Ben, or what would you suggest?
So they can reach out to me, they can reach out to Ngaire. We can find us on LinkedIn. I think it's the AMEC Global Young Leaders Group. If you search for it, it's an open group. You should be able to join. I will approve you. So that's how you can get involved. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Any other questions from the room? Okay. I mean, when you brought up a fascinating point, which is, all right, we know that there's a lot of fake news on social or lies on social. less so in traditional media. But when you have the President of the United States coming up in the White House and coming up with information which is blatantly false, that takes it to a whole new level. And not only does that take it to a whole new level, the systematic and deliberate undermining of any opponent, regardless of what they're saying being truthful or false, is another whole new dimension. As researchers and measurement professionals, what do we need to focus on when you have that kind of communications and behavior? Ngaire, why don't you start? Or if you need a moment to think about it, let's just pause, count to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then you can go, Ben, and then we'll follow up with you.
Well, I think I need more than 5. So how do we account for that? I think that's a really hard question. I think we're still grappling with it. And I think it does come down with some of the points I think Jim was raising this morning when he was talking about what went wrong with polling and some of the other methods there, is that you really need to kind of reevaluate the methods that you're taking as a researcher and making sure that, one, they're valid. You need to be really careful about the decisions you make when writing a survey or any type of architecture you put together. I'm really fascinated by behavioral economics and why we make choices, rather consciously or unconsciously, and then the whole idea of bias. And that I think we need to step back and realize that any decision that we make, even from a research standpoint, has an implication on the outcomes of that research and what we may be getting back. So I think to get around that is just to be conscious of the methods, conscious of the choices that you're making, talk to other people to make, does this make sense? And to, as often as you can, break out of your bubble and try to get other perspectives to help ensure that the work you're doing is looking at it from as many angles as possible, so that you're not isolating yourself to that, what could be a myopic point of view.
Sure. Ira?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all of that, and that it's a complex issue that sort of needs a range of complex answers. I think this is one of those issues where the best way to respond and approach research is in that wider way. Look for partnerships, look for advice, look for help. You can't necessarily answer every question on your own. You can't answer it with just one methodology. You can't. You can't be out in a silo trying to answer a question, because you will only get confirmation bias. So, yeah, I think this type of thing is a way to kind of galvanise those partnerships and galvanise a more industry robust approach to this sort of thing.
Does it shift our focus away from outputs and maybe even outtakes and outcomes much more towards impact research? Because it seems anyone can say anything at any time. Output has become a free-for-all. But maybe refocusing a lot of our work towards impact-based research may be the right way to go.
I think to a certain extent. I think one of the things that's also important in this discussion is that audiences are able to opt out of mainstream media at any point now. You can live in your Facebook feed and only ever see things that you want to see, like cat videos. You don't need to participate in anything that we consider to be mainstream anymore. So that kind of adds another layer where I don't think we have to go to the extreme of trying to answer every question. It may just be as simple as, well, here's where your audience is. They like, this is what they like. This is all of the other information they've got access to. So I think there's still some simplicity in there, and we don't have to necessarily go to the extremes.
It's challenging. Complexity on multitude of data points.
I think I've just contradicted
complex
myself.
questions, but simplicity, and we need to find that balance. Publishers, I mean, how are you going to deal with this stuff?
Well, look, just touching on those points, I think we shouldn't overcomplicate it. It's not that difficult. And going to Richard's point, it's truth or it's a lie or somewhere in between. So the narrative has changed, and I think that narrative has changed because the political landscape has changed, and we've seen that political landscape change in all various geographic regions around the globe. And then picking up on your earlier point, how do we counter that as communications professionals? We just need well-rounded communications professionals. It's not going to be difficult to sniff out the fake news. It's not going to be difficult to try and rationalise, what's right and what's wrong. What we want as analysts and as communicators are people who passes the common sense test, that your first look at it tells you there's something not quite right.
But let me challenge you on that, especially since I lost $1,000 bet to you in Washington, D.C. You're saying it's not that complicated and we should simplify. But if you take the example which you put up of that conversation between your prime minister and the president, how would you and your folks, Mediaverse now, would have measured that to tell imagine the Australian government was a client or whoever, or there was a stakeholder related to that conversation. How would you have measured that and come up with the truth saying, here's what really happened?
The way we would measure that would be in the qualitative sense, not so much in the quantitative sense. Okay. So you've got to look beyond the metrics of these. And I go to your point about the outputs and the outtakes and everything else, but the proof is in the pudding. So the way we would measure that is to have a discussion around the qualitative effect of what that language actually means. So you're reading in between the lines. If you take that on face value and the way that we rate it as analysts, it probably ends up being some kind of negative with a low score somewhere. And I think that's why we have to look through the metrics sometimes to get through to,
So you're looking at the impact with the negative with a raw score.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think to your point, Michael, about looking past the numbers, it's asking why. So we talk about what would we want in a job description in today's post-truth world, is I want people on my team are just going to ask the question why at all stages through the process.
Sure. I appreciate that. More questions from the room. Sergi.
Hi. In trying to add some answer to your question on what we do from the point of view of the research, I think it all comes down to this outputs, outtakes, and outcomes idea, or what how I call it, going from measuring reach to measuring relevance. And because, nowadays it is, we want to be relevant, and it's more difficult to be relevant in the actual communication. And the way we see it, we measure relevance through three big vectors. One is measuring context more. So you're not now today competing with your competitors or traditional competitors. You're competing for the attention of your consumers that are impacted from any company, government. So measuring context is very critical. And the second one is traceability, meaning because there are so many devices and the way information propagates, traceability is also helping you in understanding the relevance. And in this case, traceability is also very important for this identification of true or false. Traceability in this sense, from these three things, is key, I think. And the last one is what we will talk about, micro moments. So if you want to be relevant, you need to touch at the right. Consumers offer us 1,000 times opportunities to contact them. So we need to use these micro moments. This is not as relevant for the truth or the like, but it's interesting for other relevance
Thank you.
concept.
Barry, how are we doing for time? Okay. Richard.
Does anyone want to come back on Sergi's points first?
Well, we'll take your question.
Okay. Well, no, come back. Okay, because my question moves to a slightly different point, which is, are we stuck with fake news? Where do we go from here? Am I going to die an old man and people are still going to be... Is fake news going to still be an issue? Or is it a Trump effect? So perhaps it will go when Trump finally goes, and we know that if he doesn't go after 4 years, he has to go after 8. So there's hope there somewhere. And if we are stuck with it, do the panel see... I thought Sergi's points were fantastic, by the way, but does the panel see content analysis companies having an extra classification on our charts that says this bit was fake news, rather than sort of positive, neutral, unfavourable, fake? Yeah. So where do we go from here? That's my question.
Okay. So if we could have Ben respond to Sergi, measuring context and truth, and then Michael, you can take Richard's point.
I think Sergi's absolutely right about looking at the context around whatever you're researching, because I think I was really struck by the talk yesterday about what can we learn from quantum physics when it comes to research, and I thought this idea of looking for not looking at the answer directly you're looking for, but looking around the factors and aspects that impact the answer you want to understand, I think is really important, and something that we probably overlook too often, whether that's due to time or budget or what have you, but anytime we can slow down and understand the context of the situation, it's better. And I think just to quickly address Richard's point, are we stuck with it forever? I'm actually hopeful. I'm hopeful that what will happen is that citizens around the world will be more aware of the issue. I think that it's something that maybe wasn't quite as well known. Now it is. I saw some research that in Germany, trust in media in Germany is actually higher than it was in the past. So there could be a positive backlash effect. So I'm hopeful on that front.
Right. Michael?
Richard, I think I've got bad news for you, because I think it's around for a long, long time. I'm not as hopeful as Ben.
I'm always positive. I'm American. I have to be.
I think that the cut-through that fake news has received means that someone else is going to pick it up and run with it in a different format at some stage. It's proved that you can get elected running on these types of things. Some other right-wing or extreme left-wing politician will pick up on this cut-through and it will reappear in another way, shape or form. I don't think when you're lying on the beach in Mallorca, Richard, in 5 years' time, that that will be the end of fake news. I think it'll be a very different scenario.
I have Jeremy in the back, and then we'll come back to you for one more minute. Jeremy, please.
Thanks, Mazen. Jeremy from Cision. That's a beautiful image there, Michael, of Richard on the beach in Mallorca in 5 years. Picture that, and let's stop there. Hasn't fake news always been around? I mean, PR Newswire is now part of Cision. One of the things that PR Newswire does is try to weed out fake news or fake press releases. They validate every release that comes in through the business. Not every news distribution business does that. And PR Newswire, Business Wire, and all the others don't always get it right. I think Cision put out a release a few years ago that was a fake release that was designed to drive the share price of a business that some rogue investors then put money into, and blah-de-blah. Anyway, I think the interesting thing about fake news is it's the audience that is the issue, or where the audience has gone that is the issue. People have moved away from those trusted brands. But the best thing about Trump, I'm reading an article here that apparently says Donald Trump's fake news attacks on New York Times have sent the New York Times subscriptions through the roof. So actually, Trump has done a lot of good things for traditional media, and as Richard knows, I'm a traditionalist and a big believer in newspapers. So are we not just going to go through a cycle where people will go back to trusting more in the sort of traditional, established brands who are involved in investigative journalism, paid-for journalism? So could it not be a good thing?
Michael, why don't you take that very briefly, and then Ngaire, you can comment on it as
Fine,
well.
and thank you for the sort of 7 loaded questions within that, Jeremy, but I'll deal with your last one first. I think it is a life cycle, but it's a long life cycle. I think the era of quality investigative journalism has died because the new demographic that's coming through doesn't want to pay for quality journalism. And quality journalism costs a lot of money. So while our demographic and our industry loves quality journalism, the young people of today just aren't interested. And we need subscriptions to newspapers and subscriptions to content behind the paywall to pay for that type of quality journalism. So the life cycle is long. I don't see it coming back in any way soon. I take your point about PR Newswire, checking the facts of the media releases, but not everyone is as large as PR Newswire and has the availability to be able to do that fact checking. And as you know, the Newswire business is and press release distribution business, very dynamic, where things are coming through constantly, and it proves very difficult. I don't see other wire services, Business Wire, Market Wire, and others being able to adapt to where PRN is with their Newswire service and their fact checking service. So I think it's going well.
Ngaire?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of can't help but think that it doesn't matter. I mean, if audiences are our primary frame and it's about where people go to get information and how we tap into it, I don't know if it matters whether or not fake news as an idea continues or if it evolves into something else. If people are in a certain place and you want to communicate to them, communicate to them. I don't think it's...
Doesn't stop the conversation from happening.
No.
Okay. Sergi, very briefly.
Yeah, no, I don't have an answer for you, Richard, but I think it will depend on the evolution of companies like Facebook. Nowadays, digital brought transparency, but this is a very biased transparency because what we have now is huge companies with 1.7 billion users that are closed ecosystems that feed you with the information that you like. So in the end, this is feeding this phenomena. So let's see how the internet evolves, and then we will see if this transparency is true or not.
Thank you for that. Well, I think we're at the end of our time, but I would like to very quickly recap on a key statement from each of our panelists. Ben came up with that brilliant statement: trust is more important than truth, something which I think we can all ponder on and reflect upon. Ngaire is excited about the opportunity. She sees a technical gibberish of content and platforms, but ultimately it's about the passion to know the truth and maintain a dialogue between companies, governments, and their stakeholders. And that's something we can research and analyze regardless of the platform and regardless of whether the content is true or not. And from the publishing point of view, Michael gave us a bit of a grim outlook that fake news isn't going to go anywhere, but the reality is fake news has been around for a long time, but the emphasis goes back to attribution, quality, and ultimately who's going to pay for those kinds of ethics to be upheld within our environment. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause to our panelists for a fantastic panel.